Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today's day 38, and we're on our third day of Russian verbs of motion. We're looking now at determinate verbs of motion. Remember, yesterday we talked about indeterminate, meaning verbs that describe going around, whether that be kind of aimless motion or literally motion in circles or making round trips, right? Either one round trip or multiple round trips. Right, so we talked about all of that yesterday, and hopefully now that we're looking in detail at determinate verbs, you can see even more clearly how ultimately quite straightforward this distinction is, as long as we're careful to imagine what the Russian really means instead of sloppily just translating all these verbs as to go, right? So remember, for determinate verbs today, our keyword is underway. And I've mentioned already that in my experience, these determinate verbs are the ones that cause the most trouble. Um, uh, so I think, but again, it's really kind of a shame because if you remember this keyword, I think it really does nail down the meaning of these verbs. For example, if chadit means to go around by foot or to make round trips by foot, then iti means to be underway by foot. Okay, so if you unpack any example you see with iti in exactly that way, right? For example, on shul, if it were past tense, that would mean he was underway by foot. That's exactly what the verb means. Now, notice if we say that the person hasn't gotten anywhere, right? He hasn't completed a trip. He's still on his way. He's underway, right? And that is the essential meaning of these verbs. Okay, we looked at a poster yesterday and talked about flying. Here's a movie poster for a Soviet movie about World War II called Letyat Zhuravli. Okay, again, we mentioned that these flying examples are rather nice, just because they're kind of it's very easy to imagine. Let's say we look up in the sky and we see some birds. What if they're just kind of flying around in circles like vultures, or maybe they're just kind of flying around for no particular reason? We could say we could use the verb litat, right? Birds are flying around. But if we look up and we see birds that are clearly flying somewhere, like let's imagine quite literally they're in a V shape, right? They're migrating, they're clearly on their way somewhere. To describe that image, we would use the verb litiet. And that's exactly what we see in this poster, right? We see juravli. A juravel is a crane, right? One of those big birds, those big white birds. And they're migratory birds, and they're associated in Russia with with homecoming, right? And we see it in this poster, this movie, Lityad Juravli, the cranes are flying. Well, first, let's again look back at the poster, right? These two people are looking up and they see the cranes on their way. And in this case, we assume kind of hopefully that they're returning home after their migration. But whatever the case may be, they're on their way through the sky towards the destination. They are underway by air. Lityat, ani lityat. Uh, this movie is about World War II, and the meaning of the title again rests on the idea of homecoming. And tragically, the guy, the hero of the movie, there pictured in the on the poster, doesn't come home from the war. He leaves his fiancée behind, the woman in the poster, and he's shot in the war while he's trying to save one of his comrades. And by the way, it's really quite an incredible movie, very well done. Very high standards of cinematography in the Soviet Union, as you probably know. I mean, but in this movie, for example, this death scene is this incredible montage of a theme that comes up elsewhere in Russian literature. For example, in Tolstoy in his Sevastopol sketches, he describes sort of the brutalities of war and whatnot. And there's one scene that we'll read in book 4, I believe, where a soldier is essentially killed instantaneously, and yet within his consciousness, this moment is sort of extended for a very long time, such that he sort of reflects, he thinks about what's happening, he's sort of disoriented, but we still have this kind of last burst of consciousness right before the death, right? And this comes up elsewhere. We'll read a poem by Lermontov, which is really rather stunning in this type of in describing this type of situation. Anyway, let's look at some examples for being underway. Я йду в театр. Я шел в театр. Я буду идти в театр. Okay, there are the three tenses for this determinate verb. If we unpack those, we see the meaning is really quite straightforward. We just have it changing in terms of tense. I am underway to the theater. I was underway to the theater. I will be underway to the theater. Now, remember, that could mean literally on foot, but this is just the default for in-town outings, right? So even though this person may have been underway by vehicle, we're just talking about an in-town outing. So we default to motion by vehicle verbs. Now, if we're describing an actual journey to another city or whatever, then we're going to have to use motion by vehicle. For example, я еду в Москву, я ехала в Москву, я буду ехать в Москву, a female speaker here. I am underway to Moscow by vehicle. I was underway to Moscow by vehicle. I will be underway to Moscow by vehicle. That is exactly what these sentences mean, and you see how clearly that comes through if we unpack them, right? These people are on their way. They have not yet reached their destination. And again, even better than using the keyword, it would be better just to think about the Russian and imagine what the Russian would think if they hear these verbs, right? They could imagine something like, if we sort of crudely draw an arrow, something to that effect, right? Someone is on their way. They haven't gotten there yet. They are on their way. Okay, so we can use these determinate verbs quite often with a path, right? Again, we discussed how we can use pour plus the dative to describe motion around an open space, like we did yesterday, or now determinate motion along a path with this idea that we're on our way somewhere, we're making progress on a journey, right? Here are some examples with pour plus the dative. Она идет по тротуару, мы едем по улице, корабль плывет по реке, он бежал по лестнице, самолет летел по небу. Okay, so pretty clear there. The pour plus dative is simply describing a path along which we're seeing this determinate motion. I mentioned briefly the other day that these determinate verbs of motion are going to be much, much more common in official Soviet propaganda. While indeterminate verbs like ходить are almost nowhere to be found in Soviet propaganda, especially on these posters, right? Because let's think about it. Ходить would imply aimless motion. That's not ideologically, kosher, right? It's unacceptable to imply that the party, it's like we're wandering in the desert, right, for 40 years or whatever. No. We're on our way towards communism, right? That is the only ideologically acceptable motion verb we should be using in these posters. And indeed, you see verbs like idiom all the time. In fact, if we were going to choose a one-word summary for Soviet propaganda, this may well be it. Idiom. We are underway, right? We are marching. We are underway, headed somewhere, right? History has a purpose, right? History unfolds according to the laws of sort of class conflict and all this dialectic of Marxism, right? And the party and its leaders are leading us somewhere, right? Okay, towards utopia. Okay, so for all of those reasons, we see posters like this one. Мы идем дальше, вперед к коммунизму. We are underway, or we could even say we are marching further onward toward communism. Remember, communism was the end goal. That was supposed to be the end result of socialism. I forgot to mention, why would we say idiom is our one verb summary of communist propaganda? Well, note the мы, it's the мы form, мы идем. Right? So the collective, right? The ideal of the collective, we as a collective, as a communal body are on the march. Now, if you look at some of the rock songs in the blog I mentioned before, right? Especially the first thing that comes to mind are early songs by Quinoa, by Victor Tsoi. You have the striking repetition of verbs like yachaju, right? Or again, we can think of other examples. I'm just picking the simplest type of example. Now note the shift there. Ya, right? We have a single person speaking, sort of a lonely individual with feelings, right? And with ideas of, with a critical regard for the official party line or whatever. And he's moving aimlessly. He's wandering. He's kind of a slacker and he's wandering around the city, around Petersburg or whatever, in this kind of aimless way. You could also see the verb ходить used to underscore this idea of sort of a vicious circle, right? We're not going anywhere, right? This realization that history is not going anywhere, that we're sort of stuck in this kind of existential morass, right? And things are repeating over and over again with no sense of progress, right? So that those sorts of ideas, right? Aimlessness and the idea of a sort of hellish repetition, this vicious cycle, are all brought out in a lot of late Soviet rock songs where you already get this kind of fatigue with official propaganda, disillusionment, and so forth. Okay, anyway, let's look now at the forms, right? We're just simply filling in our table, and today we're adding the determinate verbs of motion, and we've mentioned already that a lot of these are either tricky to conjugate or they're completely irregular, right? So let's look at these. We've done this already, actually, for the first two verbs. To be underway by foot is iti, right? We can tell looking at that infinitive that it's unusual. The conjugation is иду, идешь, идет, идем, идете, идут. The imperative is иди. Okay, so it's just taking yol endings. We really just need to learn the root, the stem, which is id, and then add the yol endings. So be sure and drill that. Now the verb for being underway by vehicle is ехать, also irregular. Еду, едешь, едет, едем, едете, едут. The most common imperative for this is, believe it or not, езжай. Okay, we'll talk about that sometime later. I don't really want to get into it right now, but essentially it's an irregular imperative form, right? There's no way to predict that coming from ехать. Okay, let's move along to our remaining verbs. To be underway by air or by flying, right, is лететь. Okay, that's an ordinary yeah verb. So remember, those act just like e verbs. They mutate in the ya form only, if possible, and they take e endings. Okay, the verb for to be underway by water, right, which could mean swimming, sailing, floating, anything through water, is plыть. It's a v verb, just like žít, right? So remember that tag v is telling us we need to supply the final stem consonant, right, which we can't see in the infinitive. But once we do that, this is a fairly simple conjugation. Плыву, плывешь, плывет, плывем, плывете, плывут, and the imperative плыви. Finally, бежать means to be underway by running, right? That is also an irregular verb, right? So we have our hands full today with 3 irregular verbs, and it's quite a large number if we keep in mind that there really aren't very many irregular verbs in the entire Russian language. Okay, so at any rate, бежать, irregular, gives бегу, бежишь, бежит, бежим, бежите, бегут. The imperative is беги. Okay, so we have little choice but to just simply memorize that. Okay, let's choose an infinitive. Right, for the exercise, we're really just trying to choose the right infinitive. Now, remember, today we're already juggling 2 different types of verb, right? Indeterminate and determinate. So we have to be more careful in thinking which keyword applies to the English situation, going around or being underway. And I think if we stick to those 2 keywords and also think about our pictograms, the choice will hopefully be relatively easy. Number 1, where do you go every day? Okay, let's keep everything in mind. This sounds like an in-town journey, right? Someone's going somewhere every day. It doesn't sound like a real trip anywhere, just an in-town journey. So we're going to default to motion by foot verbs. Okay, is this around or underway? Well, we're asking about people's habits, so we're thinking multiple round trips. Where do you make round trips to every day as a habit. So that's going to be ходить. Ходить will be the infinitive. And I'll just translate quickly the entire sentence. Куда ты ходишь каждый день? Right, using ходить. Number 2, where are you going right now? Okay, if we run into somebody, we see they're on their way somewhere, right? And we're asking, hey, where are you on your way to? Where are you going? That sounds like it calls for идти, right? They're underway. Куда ты идешь сейчас? Right? Куда ты идешь сейчас? Number 3, you never go to Russia. Okay, there again, we're negating the idea of making round trips to Russia. That's what this person never does. They never travel to Russia. We're using ездить, right? We need motion by vehicle for this journey to Russia. Ты никогда не ездишь в Россию. Number 4, where was he traveling to? Okay, this person was obviously journeying somewhere. It sounds like a vehicle is involved, right? He was on his way. He was underway. Куда он ехал? Куда он ехал? Right? Where was he underway to by vehicle? Number 5, I often fly to Petersburg. Okay, sounds like repeated round trips through the air. Я часто летаю в Петербург. Number 6, the swan was swimming around. Okay, just swimming around in the pond or whatever. That's going to be плавать. That's pretty obvious. Лебедь плавал. Yeah, just that's it, right? Лебедь плавал. The swan was swimming around. The dog was running around. Okay, similar example. Собака бегала. Бегала, right? Indeterminate, was running around. Number 8, I'm flying to Moscow now. Okay, let's paraphrase that. I'm on my way to Moscow, right? That surely sounds like the situation. I'm on my way to Moscow. Determinate, so that'll be лететь, right? And the sentence would be Я лечу в Москву сейчас. Я лечу в Москву, right? I'm on my way by air to Moscow. Number 9, our plane was flying in circles, right? Maybe you're in a holding pattern. Maybe you're on some type of an excursion by plane or something, right? You're literally flying in circles. That's going to be летать, right? Наш самолет летал. Летал. Let's just leave it at that. Number 10, she was running down the street. Okay, sounds like she was underway by running, right? She was running along the street, running down the street. That's going to be determinate. That's going to be бежать. Она бежала по улице. Она бежала по улице. Number 11, the swan swam along the canal. It was swimming down the canal, along the canal. Okay, we have an idea not of simply swimming around aimlessly, but it sounds like the swan is on its way somewhere. Or again, it doesn't necessarily have to literally be on its way to a destination, right? It's just we see it and it's swimming along the canal. Okay, so visualize that and think about how different that is from the swan kind of just floating around, swimming in circles or whatever. Лебедь плыл по каналу, right? Along the canal, по plus the dative, по каналу. Number 12, where was he walking? Okay, now, again, some of these examples may be just slightly vague, right? Maybe we could use more context. Let's say, where was he walking to? Or let's go even further. Let's say, hey, when I saw him the other day, where could he have been going to? Okay, so it sounds like we're asking an underway question, right? Where was he on his way to on foot? Okay, past tense, куда он шел? Куда он шел? Now we should note for a moment, I actually forgot to mention it, and we did mention this the other day, that the past tense forms of iti are irregular, right? We just used one there in number 12. The past tense of iti is shol, shla, shlo, shli. So be sure to remember that. Remember, it's really quite unusual to have an irregular past tense form like that. Now, one more detail, plыть, right, to be underway by water. That's regular in the past except for the stress pattern. It has this stress pattern in which the feminine ending is stressed, but everywhere else the stress is not on the ending, it's back on the stem. That's not too unusual, right? We've seen several verbs that work like that. It's most common with verbs that are that have monosyllabic infinitives like plits. Okay, so at any rate, the past tense of plits is plil, plila, plila, plili. Okay, so we know the general meaning of these determinate verbs. Once again, we're trying to just unpack all this very carefully, look at every possible situation in which we could use these verbs. So let's look first at an ongoing one-way trip, right? That's maybe the most common usage of these verbs, right? I'm on my way somewhere, right? We're talking about an unfolding trip that's obviously one way, right? If it's still unfolding, then it can't be a round trip, right? It's a one-way trip from point A to point B that is unfolding. So let's just do a couple of simple exercises, just focusing on these determinate verbs. Let's pick the right kind of motion. Here you have a full table, right, of all the forms, including past tense. So this is a good reference table there. Let's just fill in the right forms, right? Number one, они едут в театр, а мы blank туда пешком, right? They're on their way by vehicle. Note here, we're emphasizing that they are going by vehicle, right? Они едут в театр, а мы идем туда пешком, right? They're going to the theater. They are on their way to the theater by vehicle. Meanwhile, we are on our way there on foot, right? Туда, right? We're going to there, right? Мы идем туда пешком. Number two, я сейчас, okay, I'm on my way to the cafeteria. Я сейчас иду в столовую. Where are you on your way to? А куда ты идешь? Right? Where are you headed to? And we're talking about going on foot, right? Number three, okay, we see вчера, right? This is going to be past tense. Where were you going yesterday when we saw you? Когда мы вас видели? Okay, so it's going to be шли, right? That irregular past tense. Куда вы шли вчера, когда мы вас видели? We unpack that. It means, where were you on your way to by foot yesterday? Where were you headed? Number four, let's use ехать. Откуда ты blank сейчас? Okay, sounds like we're encountering a traveler. Maybe we're running into them at the train station or the airport or something. Откуда ты едешь сейчас? Where are you traveling from? Where are you on your way from right now? Okay, let's say I'm on my way from Petersburg. Я еду из Петербурга. Okay, number five, let's read. Мы blank в Москву, когда наша машина сломалась. Right, we were on our way to Moscow when our car broke down. Okay, past tense, мы ехали. Right, we were on our way, we were underway by vehicle to Moscow. Now note again, let's imagine they're not in Moscow yet, right? They're still on their way to Moscow when suddenly their car broke down. Лететь, right, to fly, to be underway by flying. Number six, я лечу в Нью-Йорк, а они летят в Лондон. Right, I'm on my way by air to New York, while they are on their way by air to London. Number seven, плыть. Right now we're sailing, we're going by water. Мы с берега смотрели, как катер blank по реке. Okay, we were watching from the shore. Literally, we were watching how a tour boat, in English we'd say was sailing down the river, was sailing along the river, or was drifting along the river, whatever. Now you see there's a footnote in the text. This is a kind of peculiarity of tense usage in Russian. In that moment when we were looking, when we were watching from the shore, we were watching the boat go, right? We were watching a present tense situation. And essentially the clause here, the как clause, preserves the present tense, right? So in English we say we were watching, well, usually in English we'd say we watched the boat sail down the river, right? So we wouldn't even use the tense, right? But more literally we would say we were watching how the boat was sailing down the river or something. In Russian we say we were watching how the boat is sailing down the river. It's kind of awkward to try to explain that. But anyway, that's what you literally say in Russian like that. So if you're watching something happening or you're listening to someone do something, right, you use a как clause, and we say literally, I was watching or I was listening how blank is doing something, present tense. Okay, so that's all kind of tricky. Anyway, this example would be Мы с берега смотрели, как катер плывет по реке. Okay, number 8, бежать, running. Why are you running down the street? What's the deal? In what is the deal, right? What's going on? Why is everyone doing this? Почему все бегут по улице? В чем дело? Right? Why is everyone running down the street? What's the deal? What's going on? Okay, let's apply a quick куда or откуда clause, right, based on the question. So let's be on our toes. Remember, if it's куда, we're going to get the accusative. If it's откуда, we're going to need the genitive, and we're going to need to choose the right preposition. Okay, so you have that table in the book there on page 192 if you need to review that quickly. Okay, куда она едет? Where is she on her way to by vehicle? В Москву, right? That answers the куда question. В Москву. В plus accusative. Куда ты шла вчера? Where were you on your way to by foot yesterday? На вечеринку, right? To an event, на plus accusative. На вечеринку. Number 3, куда они бегут? Where are they running to? Let's say they're running to a club for a concert, All right, so our answer is в клуб на концерт, right? They're running to the club, or literally understood into the club, for this event, for the concert. Number 4, куда он бежал вчера? Where was he running to yesterday? To the столовая, в столовую, right? Он бежал в столовую. Number 5, откуда ты идешь? Where are you on your way from? Where are you coming from on foot? Okay, now we need an откуда phrase. That's going to be is plus the genitive. Из общежития. Из общежития. Number 6, another откуда. Откуда вы бежали? Where were you running from? Where were you on your way running from? Let's say from the boring lecture. You're running for your life from the boring lecture, right? Okay, the откуда phrase, remember this is an event, so we're using the na set of prepositions. So here we'll need sa plus the genitive. Со скучной лекции. Со скучной лекции. There we have the mobile vowel because we're following up the sa with another sa plus an additional consonant. Number 7, куда плывет катер? Катер. Where is the boat headed? Right? Where is it underway to by water? It's going to Vasilyevsky Ostrov, which is a big island in Petersburg. Remember, Ostrov is a noun. It's a big flat surface. So the answer is на Vasilyevsky Ostrov. Number 8, откуда он летит? From where is he underway by air? Right? Where is he flying from? Ответ, answer, is Petersburga. Right? He's on his way. He's flying from Petersburg. Let's look at this, another poster for a very famous Soviet movie. This is one of the, I don't know, maybe, it's hard to rank Soviet movies because there's so many famous ones, but I would say this would have to be top 10. Я шагаю по Москве. This is probably the most famous thaw period, the most famous movie from the ottepel, or thaw period, following the death of Stalin, when things loosened up a bit culturally. We'll talk about that maybe some other time. This movie is just a very lighthearted movie about young people kind of running around Moscow. So it's very lighthearted. It's kind of romantic. It's very sweet. And so I'd recommend watching it. It gives you a nice taste of what life looked like in post-Stalinist Russia. Okay, so the title of the film is Я шагаю по Москве, which means simply something like I'm marching around Moscow, or I'm striding around Moscow, or just more simply I'm strolling or walking around Moscow. So kind of a fancy verb, шагать, but used here just kind of very casually, meaning I'm strolling around Moscow. By the way, there's an example of a verb that certainly describes motion, шагать, but it's not a verb of motion the way we usually use that term, right? Because it doesn't have 3 infinitives. So it's just a very simple verb. There's nothing really special about it, even though it does describe motion. Okay, so let's look at this poster. And let's just describe what these people are doing. And again, we have just kind of a snapshot here. We don't really have any context. Let's pretend we have no idea what the movie is about. All we see here is a girl. She's taking her shoes off in the rain, very carefree, right? And she's looks like she's going somewhere, right? So meanwhile, the guy is on the bike. Okay, so with no further activity, no further context, we'd say "Она идет," right? She's on her way by foot, and "Он едет на велосипеде." He's on his way by bike. Moving right along, let's talk about a somewhat more unusual use of these determinate verbs of motion. Now, again, this may not come up every day, right? And this is going to lead to another breakdown, breakdown number 4. Let's quickly remember that determinate verbs of motion are imperfective, right? Now, remember, we've stressed already that both indeterminate verbs like chadit and determinate verbs like iti are both, by definition, imperfective. One is not more imperfective than the other. They are both imperfective. Okay, what does that mean? It means they can both describe ongoing action, right? For example, ongoing round trips, repetition, like repeated round trips, as we saw yesterday with verbs like chadit. Okay, so for example, iti, to be underway on foot, that is an imperfective verb. It can describe ongoing, unfolding action or repeated action. But let's describe carefully what kind of repeated action it describes. Repeated, kind of underway motion, right? Or sort of, we could say repeated one-way trips. It often works out that it means repeated one-way trips if we're being very precise about it. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Ja idu na lekciju. There's an unfolding one-way trip. Ja idu na lekciju. I'm on my way to the lecture. Or let's throw in, just to make clear, something that invokes repetition, like каждое утро. Каждое утро я иду на лекцию. Right? Every morning I go to the lecture. Okay, that's the one leg of your journey, right? That's repeated. So if we're going to describe that very kind of accurately, we would use idu, right? I make this one-way trip repeatedly every morning to the lecture. And if we draw that, repeat our little pictogram, that becomes quite clear. Now, if we break up a trip into its particular legs, its repeating legs, then we get a different kind of picture, just a repeated, different sets of arrows, right? So look in the book there, you see this kind of pictogram. For example, describing a repeating round trip. Каждый день я хожу в университет. Every day I go to the university. There's just a kind of general statement. Every day I make a round trip to the university. That's repeated round trips. Now, what if we break that repeating trip into its constituent legs, right? The way there, the way back, and so forth. Каждое утро я иду в университет, а каждый вечер я иду домой в общежитие. Right? Note how we've broken that up. I make repeated one-way trips to the university, and every evening I make repeated one-way trips home, back to the dorm. Or я обычно ехал в театр на автобусе, а шел домой пешком. Right? I would usually make repeated one-way trips to the theater on bus, right? I would take the bus to the theater, right? That's a repeated one-way trip. But I'd go home on foot, right? So repeated one-way trips, coming back home, going on foot. Now, that brings us to breakdown number 4. Okay, what we've just done is we've stuck with the system, right? And we see how if a determinate verb means it can describe an unfolding one-way trip, then we can repeat that to get repeated one-way trips. That all is very consistent with the system. But now we come to a breakdown, and this one is pretty easy to explain, right? If you're talking about where you go every day, even if, strictly speaking, you're describing a repeated one-way trip, if we sort of zoom out from that little very narrow repeating leg of a journey or repeating one-way trip, then you not only go to this place, but presumably you come home again, right? So normally, just sort of in a big picture, kind of practical sense, we're really talking about repeating round trips ultimately. right? And because of that, the round trip idea tends to trump the idea of repeated one-way trips. So to make that perfectly clear, let's throw in a little time expression that we haven't really studied yet. Восемь часов. That means at 8 o'clock sharp, right? At 8 o'clock. Восемь часов. Just to underscore that we're talking about this repeating very specific moment in time, right? That's just going to draw out the distinction here. Okay, so if we're being very sort of precise in terms of the system, we'd say каждое утро в 8 часов я иду на занятия, right? Because after all, what are you doing every day at 8 o'clock sharp? Well, you're not using you're not being beamed directly to class and back again or something instantaneously, right? No, you're on your way to class every morning at 8 o'clock. So if we're following the system and being kind of very technically accurate about it, we would get this kind of picture and we would use a determinate verb, right? Я иду на занятия. But as you might imagine, Russians are much more likely to use ходить, right? Because they understand that in terms of the big picture, every day you not only go to class, but you come home again, right? So you'd be more likely to hear каждое утро в 8 часов я хожу на занятия. Or, if we kind of a bit less strict here and we leave out the 8 часов, we say каждое утро я хожу на занятия, right? That's the kind of thing you'd hear very often, meaning I go to class every day, every morning, right? Okay, so anyway, if Russians do use the determinate verb here, there may be a little nuance of meaning in that it may emphasize that it's kind of a slog to get to class, right? It's kind of emphasizing the process of being underway to class and that it's maybe a bit of a chore, right? Now, that little nuance aside, the good news with this breakdown is that in this situation, either verb is correct, right? You can use either, they're interchangeable. Now, again, if you use the determinate, it may have this little nuance of meaning that you're emphasizing the process of getting there. It's a slog, it's a schlep, whatever, right? But that nuance aside, this breakdown, maybe ultimately it isn't really all that important, right? Because either verb is acceptable. So we'll watch out for this. Again, it's kind of a very particular little instance. But remember that in everyday speech, Russians will tend to use the round trip idea. Now, one last detail. If we're talking about repeating legs of a repeating round trip, well, we can use the round trip verb, like ходить, for every repeating leg of that journey, except for the final leg, right? So I told you we're going to leave no stone unturned here with our coverage of Russian verbs. Now let's think about why would that make no sense at all, even for a Russian who's kind of just thinking kind of vaguely about this motion, right? Well, because the final leg of the journey, that is not a round trip by any stretch, right? So for example, every day, well, I go to class, I go to the cafe, I go here, I go there, I go to all these places. We can imagine those all as repeating round trips, except for that final leg, right? Because that is, let's say you come back home to the dorm or whatever, you come home, that's not a round trip, right? That's the final leg, the repeating leg that ends at its final destination. Okay, so there you go. That's quite a bit to swallow, but again, we've covered that stuff very thoroughly. Let's look quickly at a poster. This is maybe the least subtle propaganda poster I've ever seen. I mean, just unpacking every last bit of symbolism, right? Поезд идет от станции социализм до станции коммунизм. Okay, the train is, what's our keyword? Underway, right? Again, and you see this ideologically acceptable determinate verb of motion. The train is underway from socialism station to communism station. Again, we're building socialism in order to reach the end goal, which is communism. Right? Who's steering the locomotive? Well, of course, it's the испытанный машинист локомотива революции товарищ Stalin. Right? The experienced locomotive operator, let's say the driver, the engineer of the locomotive of the revolution, Comrade Stalin. Okay, I think that's enough said about this poster. We could talk more about the various stops this train has made. But the main thing is that it's on its way to communism, the glorious station of communism. Okay, let's look at these verbs of motion here in these examples, and let's just give a keyword, or again, we could draw a pictogram to try to capture what the Russian's really getting across. Куда ты ходишь каждый день? Okay, that's multiple round trips, right? We're asking about someone's daily routine, right? Where they go, where they make round trips every day. Куда ты ходишь? Number two, куда ты идешь каждое утро в 8 часов? Okay, there's the example we saw, right? We're very specific about the time. And so if we think about that technically, the person is making multiple repeated one-way trips, right? Every day at 8 o'clock, they are on their way. So that's sort of the technically accurate usage there. Идешь, underway. Number three, когда она жила в Москве, она каждый вечер ходила в театр. Okay, that's multiple round trips, right? Every evening, back when she lived in Moscow, she would go to the theater repeatedly. Ходила. Okay, number four, она шла туда пешком, а ехала домой на маршрутке. That's a somewhat peculiar example, but it follows from example 3, right, where we're telling about her repeated one-way trips, right? She would go to the theater on foot, and she would go home by marshrutka, right? So again, imagine repeated one-way lines, right? Repeated arrows showing how she would be underway repeatedly to the theater and how she would be underway back. Right, now remember, this first part, we could use chadit in theory, but the second one, right, how she gets home, that really shouldn't be chadit or yezdit in this case, right, because it's the final leg of her repeating journey. Number five, я надеюсь, что в следующем году буду часто ездить в Россию. I hope that that next year, in the following year, I will often go to Russia. Okay, this person is pretty gung-ho about the whole Russia thing, right? He wants to go repeatedly, right? So часто ездить, he wants to make frequent, right, round trips to Russia. Number six, этот самолет летает в Сочи каждое утро. Okay, so this sounds like this plane, every day it flies to Sochi and then presumably back again. Now, if we're focused on what it does every morning, we don't know, but we don't know where it's flying from. We presume that this is technically a repeated one-way trip, right, to Sochi each morning, and then maybe back again in the evening or whatever, right? But again, because the idea of the round trip clearly takes over, you're more likely to hear litai, right? Litayet, it makes round trips to Sochi every morning. Number seven, этот корабль плавает в Helsinki каждый день. Okay, same example as with the airplane, right? This thing goes to Helsinki every day and comes back, maybe from Petersburg, right? So from Petersburg to Helsinki and back again every day. Okay, so you could use this little setup here to describe your own daily routine, right? Remember, telling about where you go every day, we could use idu or chaju, right? But the final leg of the journey, наконец я иду, for example, домой, that repeating final leg would need to be in the determinant. Okay, let's do another exercise and choose the right pictogram, or maybe for present purposes, let's do the keyword, right? So we're looking for verbs of motion, and we want to refer to the little table, right? We're now juggling indeterminate and determinate. Make sure you spot the right verb, the verb and determine, right? Is this the indeterminate or the determinate? Я тебя видел вчера в центре. Куда ты так бежала? Hey, I saw you yesterday downtown. To where were you so running, right? Where were you running off like that to, right? Okay, бежала, that's determinate, underway, right? Where were you on your way to running? Could draw a little arrow for that. Number two, ты ездишь на машине в университет или ходишь пешком? Okay, how do you get to the university? Do you go there by car or do you go on foot? Okay, both verbs ездить and ходить are indeterminate repeated round trips, right? So draw a repeated circular arrow. Number three, мы часто ездим в Петербург, там каждый день ходим в театр. Okay, two verbs, ездим and ходим. Okay, again, repeated round trips, right? We often travel to Petersburg. There, we go every day to the theater, right? So we often travel to Petersburg, repeated round trips. And when we're in Petersburg, we often make round trips to the theater. Number 4, наша собака очень любит бегать в парке. Okay, бегать, that's indeterminate. So the dog likes to run in the park. And that's just the general activity, right? She likes to run around in the park. Indeterminate. Number 5. Когда я летел в Москву, я читал роман Толстого на русском. Okay, look at that. Here's a nice example. Лететь is determinate. Okay, so let's unpack this very carefully. When I was on my way by air to Moscow, I read a novel of Tolstoy in Russian. Okay, so this person is talking about what he was doing in the plane on his flight to Moscow. Now see how nicely the Russian captures that and how accurately, right? When I was on my way by air to Moscow. Determinate. Number 6. Что тебе больше нравится, бегать или плавать? Okay, two activities, right? Do you like running or swimming better? Okay, so the general activity, that's going to be indeterminate. Бегать или плавать? 7. Корабль плывет сегодня из Петербурга в Helsinki. Okay, note the narrow time frame, today, right? Today, the ship is underway by water. It's sailing from Petersburg to Helsinki, right? We're talking about an unfolding one-way trip, right? A one-way trip. Number 8. Чтобы научиться плавать, надо ходить в бассейн. In order to learn how to swim, you need to go to the swimming pool. You need to visit the swimming pool. Okay, so the first one is just the general activity to learn how to swim, generally, плавать, indeterminate. You need to make multiple round trips to the swimming pool, right? So ходить, you need to make repeating round trips. Number 9, эта маршрутка едет на вокзал. Does this marshrutka, right, does this private little minibus, does it go to the subway? Or we could say, is it on its way to the subway? Sorry, to the train station, right? So you could, let's say you hail one of these little minibuses and you ask the driver, right, are you on your way to the train station, right? Вы едете на вокзал, right? Or эта маршрутка едет на вокзал. Number 10, автобусы уже не ходят. Надо будет идти пешком. Okay, sounds like it's late. The buses are no longer circulating. They're no longer making the rounds. That's ходить. So we'll have to be underway by foot. Okay, it's kind of emphasizing the process, right? Well, we can't take the bus. We're going somewhere. The buses aren't circulating, so we're going to have to, be on our way on foot. Идти пешком. Okay, so again, that's also emphasizing they're on their way, right? It's a one-way journey. They're trying to get somewhere. And here the emphasis is on the process of being on their way on that journey. 11. Когда я возвращаюсь домой, моя собака всегда бежит ко мне. Right? When I return home, my dog is always running towards me, right? Let's imagine the repeated one-way motion of the dog. Every time the guy is approaching the house, the dog is on its way running, right? Here it comes running. Okay, number 12. Я думаю, что этот самолет летел на юг, в Сочи, наверное. Right? I think that plane was on its way by air to the south, to Sochi, probably. Okay, so it sounds like someone spotted an airplane. It was clearly on its way somewhere, right? Летел, it was on its way, underway by air, and it was flying towards the south. Number 13. Странная птица летала весь день у нас на дворе. Some strange bird was flying around all day in our courtyard. Okay, so is this bird injured? Is it insane? I don't know, right? It's flying around in the courtyard. Летала, flying around. 14. Каждый день в 8 часов я иду на урок русского языка. Okay, repeated round trips, right? Каждый день в 8 часов я иду на урок русского языка. Now here in the example we've used idu, right? So we're being sort of technically accurate. We're talking about a repeated one-way trip. Remember, this is the breakdown, though, that you could easily see хожу used in a situation like this. Okay, number 38. Pick an infinitive you'd use here. Okay, so again, we've got very little context. Let's just pick what seems like the most appropriate Russian infinitive that we would use to translate these English examples. I go to Russia once per year. Okay, I hope this is getting easier. That's repeated round trips, right? Once per year, you make a round trip to Russia. That's going to be ездить, right? Ездить. Я езжу в Россию каждый год. Okay, number two, where are you going to Russia? Sounds like an underway example, right? That's going to be ехать. Куда ты едешь? В Россию. В Россию. Number three, she goes to the gym 5 times per week. Okay, that's going to be, well, again, repeated round trips. That's another ходить example, right? Ходить. Okay, number four, she's going to the gym right now. Okay, sounds like she's underway. We would use идти, right? She's on her way to the gym right now. Number five, my flight from the US to Russia took 9 hours. Okay, this is a kind of an example I'm not sure we've seen yet. We'll talk more about it here in a moment. What we're really saying here in terms of the Russian is I was underway by air to rush from the US to Russia for 9 hours. Right now, note how the duration is telling us for how long this one-way trip was ongoing. Right? So if you think about that a bit, it makes perfect sense that we're going to use a determinate verb. So we'd use лететь, we'd say, for example, я летел 9 часов. Number six, they were walking down the sidewalk. Sounds like an underway example, right? They were on their way going down the sidewalk. That's going to be идти, right? Они шли по тротуару. Number seven, they were walking around the city. Okay, sounds like kind of aimless strolling. That's going to be ходить. Они ходили по городу. Number eight, he was running along the embankment. Okay, sounds like an underway, right? He's not just running in circles like a madman on the embankment. He's running along the embankment, right? That's going to be бежать. Он бежал по набережной, right? He was underway running along the embankment. He was jogging in the park, okay? Now, if we saw someone jogging past us in the park, we might say бежать, but generally jogging, right? We're just emphasizing the activity generally. Someone was running around in the park. They were jogging in the park. That's going to be бегать. Он бегал в парке. Number 10, she goes home every evening at 6 o'clock. Okay, remember, that's a recurring final leg of a journey. That's the one instance where we can't use ходить. Ходить, right? We need to say идти. Она идет домой каждый вечер в 6 часов. Okay, I'm aware that we don't know how to tell clock time yet. We'll learn that soon. Okay, let's ask a few questions. And again, let's focus on what the question's really asking, and you can practice answering. Что ты обычно делаешь, когда едешь на поезде? What do you usually do when you are underway by train, right? When you're riding on the train, what do you usually do? А что ты будешь делать, когда ты будешь лететь в Россию? What will you do when you will be underway by air to Russia? Okay, so see how we unpack that, and it very accurately conveys the idea of we want to know what you're going to do during your flight to Russia. Number three, ты ездил в Россию? Or another way to ask that, ты была уже в России? Remember that exercise? Okay, right. Have you ever been to Russia? Have you made a round trip to Russia? Number four, тебе нравится летать на самолете? Do you like to fly in airplanes, right? Do you like to fly on an airplane? Okay, that's referring just to the activity generally, so that calls for indeterminate, летать. Тебе не страшно, right? Are you not afraid to fly? Number five, ты ходишь пешком в университет или ездишь на машине или велосипеде? Right? Recurring round trips. How do you get to the university? Do you go on foot or do you go by vehicle, right? Namely, by car or by bike. Number six, куда ты ходил вчера? Where did you go yesterday? На занятие, в магазин, в столовую, или в кафе. Okay, so we're asking about a completed round trip, right? Sounds like a one-time completed round trip that happened yesterday, right? Куда ты ходил or куда ты ходила. Number 7, ты любишь бегать? Okay, again, just the activity generally. Do you like to run? Do you like to jog? А где ты обычно бегаешь? В парке, например? Where do you usually run? Okay, so since the motion is confined within the space, we're asking where do you jog, right? That's a где question, right? And so one possibility is в парке. I jog in the park. Okay, let's finally look at a couple of more little blurbs, right? The future tense of determinants. We've seen one example here with the question. That's quite unusual, right? So a lot of books wouldn't even mention this. I'm throwing it out there because, again, I want to leave no stone unturned. Now, there's no reason logically we can't use the future tense of a determinant, but you'll see because of what it means, you'll understand why it's heard quite rarely, right? Let's look at an example. Когда я буду лететь в Москву, я буду читать русский роман. Let's just unpack that carefully. When I will be underway by air to Moscow, I will read a Russian novel. Okay, so we saw an example already like that. Okay, so now, okay, so you can see, it's not every day we say things like that, right? But there's no reason in Russian we can't say that. And you see how in the future, the basic meaning we've discussed carries over precisely, right? If we unpack it, буду лететь means I will be on my way by air, right? Now, here's another example taken from real life. Когда вы будете ехать из аэропорта в центр Петербурга, вы сможете увидеть огромный памятник Ленину. Okay, depending on what route you take from the airport in Petersburg, you're very likely, if you're headed right into the middle of town, to pass by a gigantic monument to Lenin. He looks like Superman with his little overcoat unfurling all around him, right? And he's pointing somewhere. He's pointing вперед, right? Onward. Okay, so again, a fairly unusual example, but this Russian nails exactly the situation we're describing. When you will be underway by vehicle from the airport to the center of Petersburg, you may see a huge monument to Lenin. Okay, so in English, in normal English, you might say something more like on your way from the airport to downtown Petersburg, you may pass this monument. But again, in Russian, and again, there are other ways to say this in Russian, right? But anyway, one way to do it is когда вы будете ехать, right? Now, here's another example, and this may be the one you hear most often. I mean, again, it's not every day, but I definitely got this from friends or whatever saying, well, hey, on your way home, why don't you pick up some mineral water, right? Okay, so for example, that would be, если ты будешь идти мимо аптеки, купи мне, пожалуйста, аспирин. Okay, so something like, for example, if you'll happen to be on your way by foot past a pharmacy, right? So if you find yourself walking past a pharmacy or something like that, right? Just so, well, stop by and grab me this or that, right? So that's a nice little example, right? But again, you can see how the future tense of these verbs is not something you see every day. Okay, finally, we saw an example like this, right? Talking about, for example, how long your flight takes or how long it takes to get from one point to another. You're likely to see determinate verbs. For example, сколько ехать из Москвы в Петербург на поезде? How long does it take, or let's unpack this carefully, for how long to be underway by vehicle from Moscow to Petersburg, and then we specify on train, right? So we could say in English, how long does it take to get to Petersburg, from Moscow to Petersburg by train? The answer, часа 4 minimum, right? Around 4 hours minimum, right? There's an E train that's kind of an express train that takes, I think, around 3.5 hours. But you can also take night trains that could take 7 or 8 hours, depending. Okay. Наконец я в Москве. Finally, I'm in Moscow. А сколько ты летела? Okay, look at that question. For how long were you underway by air? Meaning, how long did your flight take? 9 часов, right? 9 hours. Okay, завтра я вернусь в США. Tomorrow I'll return to the USA. А сколько будешь лететь? Okay, there's a future tense example, right? For how long will you be underway by air? Right? That's the equivalent of English, ordinary English, right? How long will your flight be? How long will you be on the plane? One more example. Сколько ты идешь на работу? For how long are you underway to work? The answer, 20 minut. Okay, so we don't know how to use numbers with nouns yet, so these are just here for examples to show other usages of the determinate verbs of motion. Okay, this has been quite a lesson. I've said more than I should, perhaps, but this has been a very exhaustive look at determinate verbs of motion. Tomorrow we'll look at perfective verbs, and that will conclude our coverage of these basic Russian verbs of motion. Until then, до свидания, товарищи.